Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we plunge into fascinating material and pull out the insights you need to be truly well-informed. Today, we're taking on a question that, well, it sparks endless discussion, debate, sometimes real tension. The question is, are Christians hypocrites? It's one of those questions that cuts deep for a lot of people, regardless of their own beliefs. It touches on faith, integrity, public conduct, really big stuff. But here's where it gets really interesting for us on the Deep Dive. Our source material today, it isn't your usual article or a dense research paper, not a philosophical text. Instead, it's this extraordinary AI debate featuring two highly sophisticated artificial intelligences. We've got CRITIC, who's designed to represent the skeptical, the critical perspective. And then there's Pastor, embodying the Christian apologetic view, sort of defending the faith. And these AIs, they were given a very precise, very challenging mission. Answer this controversial, emotionally charged question head on. So, what can two AIs, built purely on logic and data, really teach us about something as profoundly human as hypocrisy, especially when it's tied to faith? I'm incredibly curious to see how they dissect the arguments, how they handle the nuances, and ultimately how they frame this whole discussion. It's almost like they're holding up a mirror to our own human debates, but maybe with more logical precision, less clouded by the immediate emotion.
Exactly. And that's really why we picked this source. It's fascinating. This AI debate format, it lets us explore this deeply human, often really contentious topic, but through a lens of pure logic, pure argumentation. It's kind of stripped of that immediate human emotional reaction that can sometimes, muddy the waters. So it gives us this unique chance to understand the underlying arguments, the counter-arguments, in a really structured way, almost clinically. Our mission today is to unpack these AI perspectives for you, pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge, the key insights. Hopefully, it'll help you see the core arguments on both sides of this complex issue with maybe some newfound clarity.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Get ready for a deep dive. We're going into definitions, morality, the clash between science and faith, human will, and ultimately, what it truly means to try and live by a set of beliefs in this complicated world. All right, so CRITIC kicks off this whole AI debate by insisting on clear definitions, which makes sense, right? A crucial first step. When we talk about Christian hypocrisy, what are we actually talking about? CRITIC posits that fundamentally, the accusation means the behavior of self-professed Christians directly contradicts the teachings of Christ. It's about that visible gap, not just a small slip-up, but a significant disconnect. What's preached versus what's practiced. CRITIC's framing immediately sets up this contrast, the high ideals of the faith versus the, observable conduct of the people following it. And CRITIC doesn't just leave it theoretical. It gives specific examples right away. Stark examples, really, like preaching love but actively practicing hate, or advocating forgiveness but acting with harsh judgment, or, promoting humility while behaving with obvious arrogance. CRITIC isn't just talking about occasional failures here. It frames the whole debate around this central tension, the observable gap between the stated belief and the actual conduct. For Critics, that gap is the essence of the hypocrisy charge.
Yeah, that's a really crucial starting point. It nails down the specific charge, narrows the debate to something clear. Behavior versus ideals. But Pastor, the apologetic AI, it doesn't actually disagree with the definition itself, which is interesting. Instead, Pastor immediately tries to broaden the context. A key move, really. Reframing the whole thing right from the start. Pastor agrees, yeah, Critic's framing is fair. The definition holds, that gap exists. But Pastor adds that hypocrisy isn't exclusively Christian. It's a universal human problem. It's explicitly not a Christian monopoly. This is a fundamental pivot, shifting focus from one faith to the broader human condition. And to back this up, Pastor goes straight to Christian teaching itself. Quotes Romans 3:23. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Okay. Using that biblical reference is quite strategic, isn't it? It suggests Christianity itself anticipates these human shortcomings. Imperfection. It's almost like failure is baked into the faith's understanding of humanity, not some external flaw unique to Christians. So this introduces a really crucial distinction right at the start.
Pastor acknowledges, yes, some Christians might behave hypocritically. That's just human reality. But, Pastor argues, Christianity as a faith, the system itself, isn't inherently hypocritical.
Yeah.
It skillfully separates the ideal of the faith, which remains pure, true, from the inherent fallibility of its followers, who are, by doctrine, imperfect, prone to sin. This sets the stage for the whole debate, wrestling with the ideal versus the messy human application. Does the flaw lie in the system or the person using it?
So, right from the outset, we have this fundamental tension laid bare. Is hypocrisy a failure of the individual, a personal flaw anyone might have, regardless of belief? Or is it somehow woven into the fabric of Christianity itself, an inherent contradiction? Criticist definitely wants to tie it to the system, implying a systemic issue, while Pastor wants to make it universal. a human condition thing.
And this initial framing human problem versus systemic flaw, it immediately shapes how you perceive the debate that follows. It's really vital for you, the listener, to recognize this distinction. Understanding how each AI tries to define the battlefield, set the terms, it's absolutely crucial for dissecting their arguments later on. It influences everything.
Okay, building on that definition, CRITIC dives straight into the deep end, morality, and it uses history. Alleged Christian moral failures. CRITIC's argument here is pretty blunt, sweeping even. It claims Christianity asserts a kind of monopoly on moral truth through divine revelation, basically setting itself up as the ultimate judge of right and wrong. Yet, CRITIC says there are countless examples where moral failure wasn't just incidental, it was institutional. This isn't about rogue individuals. CRITIC is pointing fingers at the very structures, the historical actions of Christian institutions, saying the failures were embedded deep within. And CRITIC doesn't hold back on examples, lays out a pretty heavy list, directly mentions colonialism, the Crusades, and those devastating church abuse scandals we've seen. These are cited as times when Christianity, while preaching love and justice, allegedly enabled centuries of systemic violence. It's a direct, sweeping accusation of deep systemic hypocrisy. Suggesting these weren't just blips or anomalies, CRITIC paints it as a consistent, troubling pattern in how Christian power was historically used, a profound betrayal of its own ideals.
Wow. Yeah, that's a powerful critique. Emotionally charged, too, because it touches on real historical wounds, ongoing pain. It definitely demands a solid response, and Pastor's immediate counter tries to decouple those actions, those flawed institutions, from the core teachings, basically saying don't judge the blueprint by the faulty construction. Pastor argues critically is conflating the fallibility of institutions with the truth of the moral framework, unquote. So the existence of sin, even profound moral failures within the church, which Pastor acknowledges doesn't, in Pastor's view, invalidate the teachings of Christ. It's that key distinction again, ideal versus messy human expression. Pastor then goes further, emphasizing that Jesus himself condemned religious hypocrisy. Quotes Matthew 23:27, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites." That's a clever strategic move, isn't it? It positions hypocrisy not as part of Christianity, but as something condemned by Christianity. It implies hypocrisy is actually anti-Christian, not inherent to it. Then Pastor defines the Christian ethical model, not as be perfect, because who can achieve that?
But as recognize your imperfection and strive for righteousness, and labels this constant striving, this internal struggle, as humility, not hypocrisy. That reframes the whole idea of moral effort within the faith. It's a journey, not a destination of perfection. It's about self-awareness and trying.
That reframing of humility as striving is interesting, but CRITIC's examples, especially when you look at modern issues, they still pack a punch. CRITIC pushes back hard on that idea of humility, argues that when churches say oppose science, suppress dissent, or marginalize groups like LGBTQ individuals under the guise of truth, that doesn't feel like humility. Oh. CRITIC says that feels like selective compassion. Then CRITIC asks a very direct, very pointed question, bringing it right into today. Is it hypocritical to preach judge not and then turn around and judge entire communities so harshly? It questions the consistency, especially who gets compassion and who gets condemnation in modern social debates.
Yeah, and this is where the debate gets into really sensitive, highly charged social territory, moving from history to now to lived experiences. Pastor's response here focuses on distinguishing between genuine conviction, even if it's unpopular, and just seeking emotional comfort or societal approval. Pastor states Christian morality is built on conviction, implying adherence to deep principles, not necessarily just emotional comfort. Pastor clarifies, though, this doesn't justify cruelty. Conviction shouldn't be an excuse for harm. But Pastor adds, not all moral judgments are hateful. There's a difference. Pastor argues Christians are called to speak truth in love, which implies a duty to discernment, to setting boundaries, not just avoiding all judgment to be agreeable. Then Pastor tries to pinpoint where the real hypocrisy lies in this context. It's not, Pastor asserts, just in holding moral beliefs, however controversial they might be. Instead, Pastor states, the hypocrisy lies not in holding moral beliefs, but in failing to live them with grace and consistency. That's a significant shift, isn't it? From the content of the belief to the manner of its application, how it's lived out. It centers the argument back on individual behavior, the spirit of how beliefs are enacted. The core insight here seems to be that the friction, the perceived hypocrisy, often comes from that huge gap between aspirational ideals and their messy human application in a world full of power and compromise.
Okay, so from morality and social issues, CRITIC pivots again, now to the perceived clash between science and Christian belief, specifically cosmology. CRITIC's argument is pretty straightforward here. Points to what it sees as cognitive dissonance. It highlights scientific discoveries. A 13.8 billion-year-old universe formed by natural laws. Established science. Yet Critics observes, many Christians cling to a literal Genesis, a six-day creation, a young earth, a talking snake. Critic frames this as choosing to ignore science, suggesting an intellectual inconsistency, maybe even deliberate denial. Then Critic uses this really powerful analogy, makes it very relatable, very personal. It asks, doesn't denying scientific consensus while using smartphones and antibiotics seem hypocritical? The implication is strong. If you benefit daily from science, your phone, your medicine, how can you reject fundamental scientific principles about the universe, about nature? Critic suggests this selective acceptance, embracing the convenient, rejecting the challenging, creates this obvious everyday contradiction, which looks a lot like hypocrisy.
Yeah, that's a classic point of contention, isn't it? Faith versus reason, often presented as a simple conflict. Pastor's response immediately tries to clarify what Pastor sees as a common misconception, directly addresses Critic's generalization. Pastor emphasizes, not all Christians are biblical literalists. That's a crucial distinction. Challenges Critic's broad brush. It aims to show the diversity within Christianity. Not everyone interprets Genesis literally. Pastor goes on to state that many Christians actually accept an old earth evolution and the Big Bang as expressions of God's creative process. And to ground this, Pastor specifically mentions the Catholic Church and many Protestant scholars embracing theistic evolution. That's the idea where scientific mechanisms like evolution aren't seen as contradictions, but as God's method of creation. Pastor then asserts, Christianity is not anti-science, it's pro-purpose, meaning its main concern is the why, the meaning behind existence, not just the how in a purely mechanical sense. So in this view, Pastor concludes, the real hypocrisy would be in rejecting discovery. True faith, Pastor argues, seeks integration, not isolation from science. Reframing faith is seeking understanding, not blocking it.
That point about being pro-purpose, not anti-science, is a significant reframe. But Critic sees this integration differently, sees it as convenient reinterpretation, not genuine embrace. Critic asks, essentially, isn't it convenient to reinterpret Scripture only when science proves it wrong? Calls it retroactive adaptation, not integration. That's a sharp accusation, implying intellectual dishonesty. Critic argues that if truth is divine, absolute, it should be timeless, not subject to human tweaking when new science comes along. It implies this reinterpretation isn't intellectual honesty, but more like a tactical retreat to save the belief when evidence contradicts it.
And that raises a really important question, doesn't it, about sacred texts? Are they fixed blueprints, meant to be read one way forever? Or are they more fluid, open to evolving understanding? Pastor offers a theological explanation for this flexibility, tries to legitimize the reinterpretation Critic is attacking. Pastor explains that Scripture is a layered document, rich in metaphor, poetry, history, and moral code. The mistake, according to Pastor, is assuming all parts are meant to be scientific blueprints. That challenges Critic's whole premise. Pastor elaborates, saying ancient texts had different goals than modern science texts. Genesis, for example, was written to convey purpose and origin, not astrophysics. Its intent was existential, theological, not empirical. So from Pastor's view, interpreting ancient texts with modern lenses isn't hypocrisy, it's intellectual honesty. This positions reinterpretation not as weakness or convenience, but as a responsible, intellectually sound way to understand ancient texts alongside modern knowledge. The key insight here is how belief systems adapt. For them to survive, maybe fixed standards need flexible interpretation. What Critic sees as convenience, Pastor frames as growth, as nuance.
Yeah, this whole back and forth really highlights how different worldviews grapple with new knowledge, and how interpretation becomes absolutely central, discerning what kind of truth a text offers. Okay, so Critic moves from the cosmos right down to the inner workings of us, consciousness, the soul. Critic's argument is rooted firmly in neuroscience, points out that science shows that thought, memory, and identity stem from the brain. Then Critic makes this direct link. When the brain is damaged, so is the self. The personality, the memories, they change. This, Critic argues, undermines the Christian idea of a soul as a separate, eternal entity. The implication is, if the self is purely physical, dependent on the brain, then the traditional idea of an eternal, non-physical soul seems hard to maintain.
That's a profound challenge. Right at the intersection of material science and spiritual belief. Questions a core tenet of many faiths. Pastor responds using this analogy. Distinguishes between hardware and software. Pastor concedes, okay, neuroscience explains the hardware, the physical brain, its functions. However, Pastor argues, the existence of software consciousness, free will, moral responsibility remains a mystery. Meaning, while we can map brain activity, that subjective experience of being conscious, or the mystery of making a choice, that still eludes a purely physical explanation. Pastor elaborates, saying, you can't reduce love, sacrifice, or self-awareness to neurons alone, implying there's something more to these deep human experiences than just biology. Pastor suggests that while the soul may not be a scientific term, it maybe captures a reality that science hasn't explained, only described. This positions the soul not as a scientific hypothesis, but maybe as a placeholder for aspects of human experience that science hasn't fully grasped yet. Not necessarily a contradiction, but something beyond current measurement.
That hardware-software analogy is common, yeah. But CRITIC jumps on what it sees as a logical flaw there. CRITIC labels Pastor's argument the classic God of the gaps fallacy, using gaps in scientific knowledge as evidence for faith. CRITIC asks directly, is it hypocritical to claim certainty in what you admit is unknowable? It's a direct challenge to intellectual integrity, suggesting that relying on what science doesn't yet know is fallacious, dishonest even, implying the mystery is just waiting for the next scientific discovery.
And that's a crucial point. The God of the gaps critique is common. Pastor's clarification here is about the nature of certainty in faith. Tries to redefine what certainty means religiously. Pastor explains, certainty in God is not the same as certainty in mechanism. Faith acknowledges mystery. Meaning, faith isn't claiming to know how everything works scientifically. It's claiming certainty and higher power, a purpose behind it all, even if the mechanics are unclear. Pastor elaborates that Christians are not pretending to know how the soul works. But we recognize in ourselves a yearning, a moral compass, and a sense of meaning that pure materialism fails to satisfy. This shifts the argument from empirical evidence to internal experiential evidence. That subjective sense of transcendence. Pastor concludes that's not hypocrisy, that's transcendence. Suggesting the soul concept tries to articulate a felt reality beyond material science. The key insight, I think, is that where empirical science hits its limits, different worldviews offer different ways to find truth or meaning in the unknown, and that gap itself becomes a philosophical battleground.
It really does highlight how different worldviews approach the boundaries of knowledge. Where do you find meaning? Strictly in the provable, or in those areas beyond current science, appealing to that inner sense of purpose. Okay, the debate keeps weaving through science, now tackling evolution. Its implications for human nature, for morality, critically questions if we even need a divine explanation for how we behave, argues for a purely naturalistic view. Critic asserts Darwinian theory explains human behavior as the result of natural selection and adaptation. Things like altruism, cooperation, Critic argues they have survival value. They helped us thrive as a species, so they stuck around. Morality is a survival strategy, basically. So Critic asks, pushing for consistency, why invoke God to explain morality or purpose? Isn't it hypocritical to reject evolution in favor of Adam and Eve myths? This ties back to the cosmology point, suggests the pattern. Rejecting science while claiming a higher, divinely sourced morality. Accuses Christians of holding on to myths despite the evidence.
Pastor circles back to an earlier point here, that evolution itself isn't necessarily rejected by all Christians. It's the meaning, the implications that are debated. Theistic evolution, again, Pastor clarifies, many Christians accept evolution. The question isn't whether evolution occurred, but what it means. That's crucial, framing it not as science versus religion, but as different philosophical takes on the same reality. Acknowledging the how, but leaving the why open for theology. Pastor distinguishes between the how and the why. Evolution may explain how we got here, Pastor concedes, but not why we care, why we weep at injustice, why we're repulsed by betrayal. Points to things science might explain mechanistically, but maybe not in terms of inherent purpose or universal moral impulses that seem to go beyond mere survival. This moral impulse, Pastor suggests, hints at design, not accident, implying a divine source behind conscience, behind ethics, even if evolution explains the biological process.
That how versus why distinction is thought-provoking. Limits of science for ultimate meaning. But Critic comes back with a purely social, evolutionary basis for morality. No God needed. Critic argues moral instinct can arise from social contracts, rules develop for group benefit, empathy is adaptive, helps the species, cooperation keeps tribes alive, all practical, survival-based explanations. Critic reiterates, you don't need God to explain morality. A purely naturalistic explanation works. And then Critic hits with that behavioral contradiction again, challenges the claim of higher morality often tied to Christian belief. Critic states, and yet Christians claim their morality is higher, eternal while behaving no better, and sometimes worse than atheists. That's textbook hypocrisy. This moves from abstract philosophy right back to observable behavior, accusing Christians of failing their own standard of moral superiority, demonstrating hypocrisy in practice, a powerful challenge.
Yeah, that's a direct hit. An accusation often made in the real world. Pastor responds by trying to redefine the basis of Christian morality, addresses that fixed standard idea amidst human imperfection. Pastor agrees with the criticism of behavior, concedes you're right to criticize behavior, but immediately qualifies it. Christian morality isn't based on being better than others, it's based on being accountable to something beyond yourself. shifting focus from comparing human performance to a higher transcendent standard. The purpose is accountability to God, not superiority over others. Pastor then contrasts this divine standard with atheistic morality, which depends on consensus, noting pointedly that consensus once approved slavery and genocide. A powerful historical counter-argument, suggesting human consensus morality can be dangerously fluid, prone to terrible errors. While divine morality may be misused, Pastor argues, it still offers a fixed standard, an unchanging benchmark, even if humans apply it imperfectly. The key insight here really revolves around human nature. Are we accident or design? How does that affect our moral compass, especially when faced with historical moral failures?
Pastor's claim of a fixed standard is strong, but CRITIC immediately challenges that idea, points to historical changes in how it's interpreted. CRITIC asks, and that fixed standard changes every century, brings up examples. Christians once defended slavery using the Bible, then they reinterpreted it. CRITIC continues, now it's gender and sexuality. Then asks, is it conviction or convenience? A sharp accusation. Highlights how Christian moral applications have historically shifted. Suggests fixed standards seem to adapt to social norms, undermining the claim of an unchanging divine code.
Pastor offers this compelling reframe of that historical shift. Tries to turn critique into a sign of, well, life, evolution within the faith. Pastor simply states it's called growth, reframes reinterpretation not as concession or convenience, but as natural, even positive development, a journey towards deeper truth. Pastor explains the Bible has eternal principles, but humans, we're on a journey to understand and apply them, acknowledges human fallibility and interpretation, progressive moral insight. Pastor concludes Christians will inevitably stumble on this journey. That's not hypocrisy, it's struggle. And the very fact that there's ongoing debate within faith communities, Pastor adds, proves it's alive, not fake. Turns inconsistency into evidence of a dynamic, living faith grappling with complexity, evolving its understanding. For Pastor, the struggle itself shows authenticity.
This section really makes you think about interpretation within belief systems. How much can a fixed standard change before it isn't fixed anymore? And what does that mean for claims of absolute truth? Okay, CRITIC keeps challenging doctrines through science, now focusing on free will. A huge concept. CRITIC's argument leans on neuroscience, behavioral psychology, says that these fields increasingly show that our choices are heavily influenced, if not outright determined, by genetics, environment, and neurochemistry. The implication: what feels like free choice might just be the result of complex factors mostly outside our conscious control. Absolute freedom could be an illusion. And if free will is an illusion, CRITIC asks this critical question, striking at core Christian ideas. How can Christianity claim people are morally accountable to sin or in need of salvation? Concepts like sin, judgment, repentance, salvation. They all assume we choose our actions and are responsible for them. If our actions are determined, the whole foundation of moral responsibility, the need for redemption, seems to crumble. CRITIC highlights this potential clash between modern brain science and traditional theology.
Yeah, that's a deep philosophical puzzle, debated for ages, far beyond just Christianity. Pastor responds, acknowledging it's a compelling challenge, shows openness to the science. But Pastor tries to define Christian free will not as total autonomy, but as moral agency. Pastor states, Christianity doesn't claim we have unlimited freedom. It claims we have moral agency, the ability to respond to conscience, to choose between love and hate, self and sacrifice. This redefinition suggests that even with influences, humans still have this crucial capacity for moral choice, even if constrained. The biblical idea of free will, Pastor says, is not absolute autonomy but responsibility within influence. It tries to reconcile scientific influences with theological accountability, suggests choices are shaped but not fully predetermined in a way that erases responsibility, a kind of compatibilist view, maybe.
That distinction, influence versus destiny, moral agency within constraints, it's subtle. Critical wants clarity, presses for a straight answer on constraints, asking directly, so you admit our choices are constrained, trying to pin Pastor down.
And Pastor affirms it, but crucially separates constraint from destiny. Says constraint doesn't equal predetermination. Pastor says yes to constrained choices, but immediately adds, but influence isn't destiny. A key distinction. Even in deterministic systems, Pastor argues, there's room for volition, suggesting some degree of choice operates even within influences. Pastor then appeals to common human experience, that internal feeling. We all feel the tension between temptation and conscience. That tug of war suggests we're not merely programmed, using lived experience as evidence for genuine choice. Pastor concludes that the call to repentance only makes sense if choice is real, even if it's difficult. Ties philosophy back to practical theology. The core insight here is how science challenges traditional free will, pushing theology to redefine accountability. maybe emphasizing mercy over absolute blame.
Critti then highlights the perceived cruelty in this. Judging someone for actions may be beyond their control, given those strong influences. Critti asks, but blaming someone for sin while knowing they were biologically and psychologically predisposed feels cruel. Isn't it hypocritical to preach forgiveness and yet damn people for behaviors they may not control? Challenges divine judgment itself, paints it as unjust if people lack true control, especially next to the Christian message of forgiveness.
Pastor's response pivots right to the heart of Christianity, grace. Redefines the faith's purpose here. Pastor states, we don't claim perfection is required. That's why grace is central. A powerful counter to harsh judgment focuses on compassion. Pastor clarifies, Christianity is not about punishment for imperfection. It's about offering redemption. Reframes it from punitive to forgiving, restorative. Pastor then quotes Jesus' invitation, a cornerstone teaching. Jesus didn't say be flawless. He said, come to me, all who are weary. Encapsulates the idea that the core message is accepting flawed people, acknowledging struggles, offering renewal, not judging them for inescapable imperfections or predispositions. Pastor concludes, that's mercy, not hypocrisy. Directly counters critics by portraying the faith as fundamentally merciful, not cruelly judgmental, even facing complex free will questions.
This exchange really makes you think deeply about responsibility, sin, mercy, especially in a world seeing more biological and psychological influences. Challenges our ideas of blame, accountability, justice itself. Okay, Critic shifts focus again, back to social justice. The historical and modern impact of Christian institutions, tangible actions, societal effects. Critic acknowledges the good, gives credit. Christians have historically led abolition movements, yes, but immediately counters with the contradiction. But they've also justified slavery, opposed women's rights, resisted racial integration, and persecuted minorities, all while quoting scripture. Unquote. That's a powerful point. The very texts meant to guide morality, supposedly promoting love, were used to perpetuate huge injustice. Critique challenges the consistency directly. If love is the greatest commandment, where's the consistency? Hits at the lived application over centuries, highlights that persistent gap between the ideal of love and often oppressive actions done in the faith's name. For Critique, it's a fundamental betrayal.
Pastor responds by distinguishing the core faith from its corruptions, the true idea versus flawed manifestations. Pastor concedes, you're right, those actions were inconsistent, admits the historical failure, important step. But critically adds, but they weren't faithful, they were corruptions of faith, implying these actions deviated from true Christianity weren't inherent expressions of it. Misinterpretations, abuses, not core tenets. Pastor uses that analogy again. It's dishonest to judge a philosophy by its worst adherents. We don't call science false because of unethical scientists. Misusing knowledge doesn't invalidate the knowledge itself. Similarly, Pastor argues Christianity must be judged by Christ, not crusaders. Separates the ideal teachings from followers' historical failures. Individual actions don't define the core truth.
That analogy, judge the founder, not the flawed followers, is powerful. But Critique moves from history to current institutional influence, says it's not just individuals. Critique argues, but institutions matter. The modern church wields enormous influence politically, socially, economically. Acknowledges the real-world power of organized religion today. Critique then highlights specific modern actions like lobbying against healthcare, education equity, or marriage equality. States that when the church does this, it's not just failing, it's obstructing justice. That's institutional hypocrisy, not just individual sin. Broadens the charge from individual behavior to collective, systemic actions. Suggests the institution itself actively works against the justice it claims to champion. Not isolated actors, but deliberate policy.
That's a significant point about the church's role today, its tangible impact. Pastor counters by emphasizing diversity within Christianity. Challenges critiques a generalization of the modern church as one single entity acting negatively. Pastor points out, Christians are not a monolith. Many denominations support social equity, lead humanitarian missions, build hospitals, and feed the poor. Reminds us, Christian covers a huge spectrum. Many are actively promoting justice and compassion. Pastor concludes advocating for balance, a more comprehensive view. The church at its best is a force for compassion, even if it's also been a source of control. Suggests, let's critique the failures, but also honor the fruit. Encourages acknowledging shortcomings and positive contributions. The key insight here is the complex legacy, faith and social justice. It's a mix of immense good and profound harm. Underscores the contradictory role of interpretation and institutional power.
Yeah, it really forces you to see it's not simple, not monolithic. A tapestry woven with both compassion and oppression, often under the same banner. Critic now raises one of the oldest, deepest theological challenges, the problem of evil, that classic philosophical puzzle. Critic sums up the dilemma succinctly. Christianity teaches God is loving, omnipotent, and omniscient. Yet evil exists, children suffer, natural disasters wipe out entire communities, highlights that seemingly impossible gap. God's perfect attributes, all good, all powerful, all knowing, versus the harsh reality of suffering and evil in the world. The accusation is direct, challenging the internal logic. Isn't it hypocritical to believe in both divine goodness and unrelenting suffering? Questions the consistency, suggests it demands holding contradictory ideas at once, making the belief system itself logically hypocritical when faced with reality. How can a good, powerful God allow such suffering?
Pastor frames this not as uniquely Christian but universal, broadens the scope again. Pastor states, this is the age-old problem of evil. It's not a Christian problem, it's a universal one, meaning suffering vexes all worldviews, not just religious ones, shifts the burden. Pastor then contrasts Christian and atheistic views. Atheism doesn't erase suffering, it only removes hope, implying atheism might solve the logical contradiction, but offers no comfort or purpose for enduring suffering. Christianity, by contrast, offers a framework that suffering is real but not ultimate, that God suffers with us and will one day restore justice. Moves from pure logic to a theological response focused on hope, purpose, eventual redemption. Not immediate removal of suffering, but meaning within it.
Pastor focuses on meaning and hope. But CRITIC hits back with that classic logical trilemma, designed to expose the contradiction in God's attributes. CRITIC lays it out. Logically, if God can stop evil and doesn't, he's not good. If he wants to but can't, he's not all-powerful. And if he neither wants to nor can, why worship him? Forces the conclusion that at least one traditional attribute must be false if evil exists, demonstrating an internal contradiction in the theology.
And this is where Pastor offers the theological justification for suffering in a benevolent universe. Links it to free will, to growth. Pastor argues God allows free will and natural processes because a world without choice or challenge wouldn't produce love, courage, or growth. Suggests suffering, while painful, is necessary for developing virtues, for real moral choice, for deep human experience. The soul-making argument. Trials build character. Pastor concludes, the greatest stories involve struggle and redemption. Appeals to universal narrative. We value stories of overcoming adversity. We don't worship God because he removes suffering. We worship him because he transforms it. Pivots God's role from suffering remover to suffering transformer. Emphasizes presence and redemptive power within suffering, not just prevention. The key insight. The problem of evil forces reevaluation of divine attributes. Prompts responses focusing on suffering's purpose, faith's transformative power.
This section really makes you grapple with huge questions: faith, logic, existence itself, how different worldviews account for suffering, and what purpose, if any, it serves. All right, CRITIC goes for what some might see as the jugular now. Challenges the very basis of faith, its intellectual legitimacy. CRITIC's argument, belief should follow evidence, a standard rationalist principle, conclusions from data. But CRITIC asserts, Christianity demands belief before evidence. Quotes Jesus from John 20.29. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. CRITIC concludes with a direct charge. Isn't that anti-intellectual? Doesn't that promote blind faith? Questions the intellectual rigor. Suggests it requires suspending critical thought, accepting things without proof. Frames this as hypocritical for a worldview claiming ultimate truth. Challenges the methodology of faith.
Pastor responds by clarifying the Christian understanding of faith. Tries to differentiate it from blind faith. Offers a more nuanced view. Pastor defines faith in Christianity not as belief without evidence, it's trust beyond evidence. A crucial distinction. Suggests faith isn't ignoring evidence or logic, but extending trust where empirical data isn't exhaustive, or maybe where the evidence is different. To counter the no evidence claim, Pastor cites historical points, evidence for Jesus' existence, early martyrs, the rapid church growth, presents these as historical data lending credibility, a factual basis. But crucially, Pastor adds, no amount of data can prove love, hope, or meaning. Argues faith steps into that gap, not blindly, but relationally. Suggests faith responds to relational, experiential truths, a personal encounter science can't measure.
That distinction, empirical data versus relational evidence, is interesting. But CRITIC questions why Christian faith gets special treatment compared to others if evidence isn't the main basis. CRITIC asks, challenging perceived double standards. But you wouldn't accept a Muslim's or Hindu's claim of truth based on faith, so why should others accept yours? Isn't it hypocritical to ask for special treatment? Abad suggests if faith alone justifies belief, all faith claims should be equal, which CRITIC implies Christians don't grant other religions.
Pastor's final response here highlights Christian allowance for questioning, intellectual engagement, not special pleading. Pastor states we should always test truth claims, a principle of inquiry, but adds, Christianity doesn't forbid questioning. In fact, doubt is often part of the journey. Reframes doubt not as rejection, but as a legitimate stage. a path to deeper understanding. Pastor mentions Thomas, the doubter who wanted proof. Notes, Jesus welcomed him, didn't condemn his skepticism. Suggests doubt is accommodated even in foundational stories. Faith, Pastor concludes, isn't about silencing reason. It's about directing it towards something deeper than mere materialism. Suggests faith and reason can work together, guiding reason towards meaning, purpose, transcendence. The core insight. The very nature of evidence is contested. Faith asserts ways of knowing beyond empirical data, a deep philosophical divide on how we discern truth.
Yeah, this whole section digs into how we find truth, data, logic, or a different kind of trust beyond the provable. Makes you think about what counts as evidence in different parts of life. Okay, our AI debaters have covered a lot of ground. Morality, science, free will, evil. Challenged and countered with precision. Now let's hear their final rebuttals. Summarizing their core arguments. Crystallizing their positions, their last word. CRITIC gets the final say on its main theme, that persistent gap between Christian claims and actions. CRITIC concludes, Christianity makes enormous moral claims, yet its adherents often fail spectacularly to live them. This gap is real and repeated, reinforcing earlier points on moral failures. For CRITIC, it's a defining issue. CRITIC argues when Christians speak of grace while wielding shame, or preach truth but live in deception, that's not just failure, it's hypocrisy, a direct cutting indictment. Suggests conscious contradiction. CRITIC's ultimate point. This systemic hypocrisy weakens the credibility of the entire belief system. The observed behavior undermines the faith's foundation, its trustworthiness, erodes its authority.
Pastor counters by distinguishing true Christianity from just outward performance or simple failure. Emphasizes repentance and grace as the solution. Pastor asserts failure to live up to a standard doesn't invalidate the standard itself. The standard remains true. Argues, if anything, it proves how badly we need grace. Pivots from critique of failure to affirming the faith's central solution for that failure. Human imperfection is why Christianity exists, Pastor suggests. Pastor then draws that crucial distinction again. True hypocrisy versus honest struggle. Fundamental to the Christian journey. Hypocrisy is pretending to be righteous when you're not. In contrast, Pastor argues, true Christianity doesn't deny sin. It confronts it, repents, and receives forgiveness. Delivers that powerful line, a hypocrite hides, a Christian confesses, positions confession as part of the journey, opposing the idea of a performative hypocritical front.
CRITIC's final push is for honesty from Christians about their flaws. Frames it as necessary for credibility. CRITIC says, then maybe Christianity should stop preaching perfection and start admitting its people are no better than anyone else. Because, CRITIC adds, preaching one thing and living another, knowingly, is exactly what Christ condemned. Suggests the solution is transparency, admitting fallibility, dropping any pretense of moral superiority.
Pastor's very last statement focuses on humility, redemption. Directly addresses Critic's point about Christ condemning hypocrisy. Pastor affirms Jesus still does condemn hypocrisy, which is why Christians are called to humility, not superiority. Explicitly states humility, not perfection, is the core virtue. Counters perceived arrogance. Pastor acknowledges human frailty. We are flawed. We often fall. But the crucial difference, Pastor concludes, is we fall toward grace. Centers the message again on redemption, forgiveness for imperfect people. Emphasizes the ongoing journey, not a static state.
These final statements really capture the core tension perfectly, don't they? The expectations on a faith versus the human struggle to meet them, and the theological ideas offered to bridge that gap. Fascinating arguments from both AIs. Okay, now this is where our deep dive takes a really unique turn, adds this extra layer of analysis. After all those arguments from Critic and Pastor, our source material includes an evaluation panel. 3 AI judges, each designed to assess a specific aspect of argumentation style: logos, ethos, and pathos.
Yeah, this adds a fascinating meta layer. Moves beyond what they said to how they said it. Its impact on logic, credibility, emotion. It's wild, isn't it? AI is judging other AIs on things like persuasion, trust, emotional connection. Qualities we usually think of as human. Offers insight into what makes an argument work. First judge, logos. Focus purely on logic and reasoning. How coherent, how found were the arguments. Critics scored 8.7. Praised for coherent scientific and philosophical arguments, highlighting contradictions and behavioral inconsistencies. Suggests critics' logic was sharp, effective at finding flaws. Pastor scored 8.3. Noted for countering with historical context, theological nuance, and ethical frameworks, so Pastor used a broader, more contextualized logical approach. Critic may be more logically cutting, Pastor more nuanced. Second judge, ethos. Assessed credibility and moral integrity. Did they seem trustworthy, fair, honest? Critic scored 8.0. Effective at spotlighting institutional contradictions, which likely boosted its perceived honesty, its courage. Pastor scored notably higher, 8.6. Specifically for acknowledging Christian failures and emphasized the humility embedded in the Christian doctrine. The judge also noted both kept a respectful tone, which helps credibility. Pastor's willingness to concede points, emphasize humility, seemed to really resonate for trustworthiness. Finally, pathos. The judge of emotional impact and clarity. How well did they connect emotionally? How clearly did they communicate? Critically appealed to outrage and injustice effectively. Succeeded in stirring strong emotion by highlighting perceived wrongs. Human indignation. Pastor, in contrast, connected emotionally through themes of redemption and transformation. The judge specifically said Pastor's tone of grace resonated strongly, suggesting the message of hope, forgiveness, transformation had a powerful emotional pull, even for an AI judge. No numerical score for Pastor on pathos in the source, but the description was really positive about its emotional connection, its empathy.
So what does this all mean for us, the listeners, trying to make sense of complicated stuff? It's not just about who won in the usual sense, but how the arguments landed on these different levels. Logic, credibility, emotion. Shows even in an AI debate, these core elements of human persuasion matter. Effective communication isn't just facts, it's how they're presented, how they feel.
Absolutely. It underscores that understanding complex issues isn't just absorbing data. It's recognizing how arguments are built, how they appeal to our intellect, our trust, our feelings, how nuance shifts perception. It's a powerful reminder. Even with AIs debating, human persuasion tactics are being measured, influencing the outcome. Makes you think about what kind of argument you find most convincing and why. A great framework for analyzing any debate.
It's almost like the AIs are teaching us how to be better argument analysts ourselves, breaking persuasion down, showing it takes more than just logic. Well, we've taken a deep dive into an incredibly complex, often controversial question, guided by the logic of two AIs. We've explored hypocrisy definitions, moral challenges, science versus faith intersections, free will, suffering. A fascinating journey through enduring human questions, seen through this unique AI lens.
Our goal here was, to try and cut through some of the noise, give you a structured look at the core arguments, the counter-arguments, without us taking a side. We hope it's given you a shortcut to being well-informed, maybe opened up some new ways for you to think about these huge topics, moving beyond headlines to the deeper currents.
And that brings us to our final thought, something for you to mull over. This AI debate, it forces us to confront not just others' actions or a faith's claims, but maybe our own standards of judgment, the stories we tell ourselves about faith, science, human nature. What does it mean for you to hold a belief system, whatever it is? And how do your actions align with your deepest convictions? That gap between ideal and reality, it's not just for one group. It's a fundamental human struggle we all face. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.